Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Simon Gaskell. I'm President and Principal of Queen Mary, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 11th annual Drapers Lecture, which brings to a close our annual Teaching and Learning Conference, which has been going on all day. It's a highlight of the annual calendar, this lecture at Queen Mary, not least because the name of the Drapers Lecture allows us to celebrate the connection with the Drapers Company that has been so important to this institution from its very foundation, and I'm delighted that there are representatives from the Drapers Company here this evening. Now, we have, I think, had an excellent day of lectures, seminars, discussions around the theme of teaching and learning, in particular talking about teaching excellence and the interrelationship with internationalization, which is of key importance to this institution and indeed many others, but I think particularly this institution. The conference opened, as most of you will know, with a poster session in the Octagon, and many of you, I hope, will have voted for your choice of the most inspirational poster, the one that is most likely to change your practice of teaching as you go about your business here at Queen Mary. So I have the pleasant task, first of all then, to announce the outcome of the vote. So metaphorically, I'm slitting the envelope opening now. Imagine the drum roll, theatrical flourish. The winner was a poster called Using a Group Feedback Approach to Enhance Evaluation of Undergraduate Clinical Teaching, led by Maria Hayfron-Benjamin. I believe Maria is actually not here, so a substitute is going to accept the prize. Do I have a prize?
Well, I have it, and I will make sure that she receives it.
Fine, okay, good. Thank you very much. So, and I think actually, just as a general point, the quality of the posters was quite extraordinary. And indeed, we had a visitor from Hefke earlier in the day who made a point of opening his lecture by saying he knew we were good at research and he knew we were good at widening participation, but he'd been inspired by what he'd seen in the posters with respect to the quality and the commitment to teaching and learning here at Queen Mary. Now, as I said, this is the annual Drapers Lecture. The 11th one. The previous presenters of this lecture make a very distinguished list, and I suppose as time goes on we'll have to abandon the tradition of reading out previous lectures. It'll get too long, but we're just on the cusp of that, so let me tell you who has given this lecture previously. Tessa Blackstone, Anne Morrison, Graham Gibbs, Martin Bean, David Weatherall, David Watson, Steve Smith, Marcus de Sotoy, Baroness Morris, Peter McPhee. And so this is a very distinguished roll call of lecturers, indicating, I think, how much importance we attach to this lecture here at Queen Mary, and indeed the success we have in attracting highly distinguished speakers to come and present this lecture to us. And no exception this year. We welcome Joe Beale as the Drapers Lecture for this year. Joe is Director of Education and Society and a member of the Executive Board of the British Council. She is a graduate of LSE, and her past roles include Professor of Development Studies at LSE and also Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town. She is a specialist in international development, in international higher education, and she has undertaken extensive research on cities in fragile and conflict situations and related areas. Her remit at the British Council is global, and her academic research has taken her to Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with extensive periods of research in Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, and South Africa. And just speaking to Jo, I think she's about to go on a sort of tour of all those places by the sound of the complex agenda you have for the next few months. Jo has written numerous books and articles on a wide range of topics, including governance and civil society, inclusive development, and cities and fragile states. She is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and of the Royal Society of Arts, and was recently awarded an honorary degree by the Open University. So, once again, we are continuing a fine tradition of distinguished speakers here at the Drapers Lecture here at Queen Mary, and it's therefore a great pleasure to welcome Jo and to invite her to give her presentation entitled Intellectual Property, Rights, Risks, and Rebellions in International Higher Education. Jo.
good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to give this lecture. I'm very honoured and feel very privileged to be here and to share some thoughts with you. The title of my talk is not about intellectual property rights as we understand them, but whose property are international students? Whose property are international researchers? So that's where it comes from. International students are hot property. They bring economic and social benefits to the universities they're a part of, the towns and cities that they live in. And researchers and scholars themselves create valuable intellectual property through research and innovation and contribute to the growth of national development and knowledge economies. But at the same time, as we recognize this, we recognize too that there's increasing global competition for the brightest and best minds. And that means both students and researchers who are good, who are considered to be the brightest and the best, are being wooed from all quarters of the globe. And in this context, I want to look at to whom this intellectual property belongs. In a recent article in Nature, Jonathan Adams, talking about research, argued that we're now in a fourth age of research. So the first stage was one that prioritized individuals, the individual investigator. We then moved into a second age where what was prioritized was the institution. So global rankings, competition between institutions, all led to institutions competing with each other for the brightest and best minds and as centers of research excellence. A third age, you might argue, is where research feeds into national development agendas. And if we look at some of the commodity-producing countries that are looking to diversify their economies into knowledge economies, if you look at countries like our own that are trying to compete as knowledge economies, research is an absolutely critical component of national economic development. And in relation to the fourth age, what Jonathan Adams says is that we're moving into an era of global collaboration where the agendas are too big, the research too costly, the prospects of working as individual scholars too insignificant or without sufficient impact, and this fourth age is one of collaboration. What I'm going to look at, against a background of exploring some of the areas of international research, is whether we're entering a fourth age of international students or teaching and learning, knowledge dissemination. We can identify times when teaching and learning was about the individual scholar, their rights to an education, and that was very much tied up with publicly funded education where every individual was thought to have a right to an education. A move into institutional competition for offering the best to students. Again, national economies wanting to develop their skills base, and we see it right now in the UK with the with the industrial strategy, a focus on skills and professional development. So teaching and learning very much about national economic development. Are we in a fourth age where students are actually global property, or perhaps masters of their own global futures? And in looking at that, I'm going to pay some attention to transnational education, drawing on some research that we've done at the British Council on the impact of transnational education, which most of us in the UK are involved in, if we're involved in international education at all. And some of the impacts that this has both on individual students, but also on national higher education systems. It might be good for us as providing institutions or as partners? Is it good for host nations? So, in overview, a little bit on research collaboration, something on teaching and learning in an international perspective, something on transnational education, and then I'm going to move into something that's slightly more of a philosophical mode, looking at public and private goods elements of higher education and what the impact of internationalization is on that, on education as knowledge production, the research side, knowledge dissemination, the teaching and learning side, but also then thinking about that third element of higher education, the applicable, or the application, the accessible application of knowledge, the engagement of universities with society, with their local communities. And in the Draper's lecture, where we are celebrating the relationship between a university and its civic engagement, I think it's appropriate to look at that third element of higher education and to ask what impact internationalization is having on that area. And I'll conclude with some more controversial points, I think, about where I think some of the rebellions are happening within the higher education arena in the context of what some people call the commoditization of higher education. What is happening? Who's rebelling? A few references to what's going on in the UK, and then drawing on my experience in South Africa, where you will know there have been devastating challenges and violent outbreaks of resistance and rebellion on university campuses, and try and put that in some kind of international perspective. So if we look first of all at international research collaboration, I think it's now quite well established that working internationally as researchers is de rigueur and indeed absolutely necessary if you don't want to be disenfranchised from your particular research community. We know that a British Council analysis of Nobel Prize winners, for example, has shown that most of them have worked internationally. I think the majority of UK's Nobel Prize winners were either not born or spent a lot of their time studying or researching in another country. So international collaboration is important for individual careers. We know that there are a number of benefits, and these include citation rates. They include the fact that if you work with international co-authors, the impact of your research is greater. And we know that from Jonathan Adams' research that homegrown papers fell in terms of volume of output and impact, while those that were produced through international collaboration rose. I think if you look at the nature of international research collaboration, you can identify three clusters. One of the volume leaders, and the UK is among that group, along with US, Germany, France, Italy, China, and Japan. So those are the big producers. But then there is another group of research producers and collaborators who produce smaller output but with much greater impact. And UK is again there alongside Switzerland, US, Netherlands, and Sweden. And then a third group, which is your emerging countries, who are growing in importance as emerging markets increase in economic growth and increase their investment in research infrastructure and spending as part of their national development strategies. And there is a direct relationship there to citations and, by extension, the status and ranking of the institutions which the academics involved are part of. I share this slide of the top UK collaborative research partners, in part because it's important to see who traditionally UK works with and how important they are. And among our chief collaborators are, of course, the European countries. Now, you can argue that that is driven by Horizon 2020, and you could put other incentives in place to ensure research collaboration with other countries. But it is important, and it's important to recognize this in the context of Brexit, but also in the context where a lot of our research funding at the moment is tagged as overseas development assistance with countries that are eligible for ODA. And that makes it really difficult for the UK to contribute to collaborative research funding in the more mature economies. Despite all this, I just want to show how well the UK competes. So we've just 9.9% of the world population, but have 16% of the most highly cited papers, and rank second, in spite of our small size, only to the US. To highlight the importance of international postgraduate education, the fact that 7% of all doctoral students in the UK come from outside of the UK. Some of our science departments are 90% dependent on international students, and particularly at the postgraduate level. We are mobile as researchers in the UK. More than half of our output is with international collaborators. As I've said, more highly cited. And international researchers are more productive. But what we have is rising competition from the BRIC countries. So if you look at China, which is the yellow one, dramatic rise in investment in higher education. In India as well, South Korea, Brazil, and Russia. We could add to that Saudi Arabia. And across the world, beyond the BRIC countries, there are 49 countries that maintain higher education systems that publish both in the sciences and the social sciences more than 1,000 journal articles per year. And that's considered a useful threshold indicator of the presence of national research and doctoral capacity. And this represents an increase of almost 30% in the number of countries with this significant research capacity over the last 15 years. Many of the new powerhouses are in the emerging economies. They're investing heavily as part of their national planning processes, and it means countries like ourselves cannot afford to be complacent. Now, one of the challenges of this internationalization is that it makes it more difficult for any country, ours or any emerging market investing in research, to conserve their scientific wealth, whether it's as scholarly talent or as intellectual property. And the international collaboration around research goes against what we're seeing at the moment, which are more protectionist policies, which could indeed filter into the world of research and higher education. So in conclusion, what we can argue, I think, is that globalization of research collaboration is a relatively positive force, or at least a benign force, not least of all because the global challenges that research has to address are sometimes too expensive to investigate for any one national system to fund. I think if we're looking at that notion of the public good and research on the public good, it's useful, I think, to look at what the global public goods might be. And Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, looks at 5 of them. International economic stability, international security or political stability, international environment, humanitarian assistance, and importantly, for present purposes, knowledge. So global research and knowledge production is, one could argue, a global public good. And particularly when it's deployed towards stewardship of our shared earth. But there are pitfalls, so one can't be completely rosy-eyed. And what I see very much when I work with universities and higher education systems in Africa, for example, is that often the global research foci bypass national priorities. So if you just take, for example, the issue of urbanization, which is one close to my heart, and look at the research funding that's gone into addressing problems or issues arising out of rapid urbanization. This is fantastic, but not if you are a predominantly rural African nation. So one of the issues we've got to look at is how we balance addressing the big global challenges with national priorities and ensuring that the giddy heights of global research funding don't eclipse resources going to national or local priorities. And I think another area that we have to keep a very careful eye on is that research in the social sciences and humanities doesn't get eclipsed in the same way. So if we move then from research to knowledge dissemination, the second area, teaching and learning, what are the trends there? Well, the first trend is increasing demand. There's been an increase in the number of internationally mobile students, and that relates to increasing demand for higher education enrollment more generally. And a key driver of that demand, and you can see the countries there which are the fastest growing with the most youthful populations, a key driver is demography. So tertiary education enrollments globally have gone up from 170 million to 170 million in 2009 at a rate of 160% growth since 1990, an average growth rate of 5 to 6%. So we've seen that in our own classrooms. We expect that to slow down somewhat. And certainly it's going to slow down in China, which is one of the biggest sending countries. But there are others where you will have still an increasing demand, a demographic dividend for higher education, if you like. So that's key. And the other important driver is the macroeconomic driver, clearly illustrated by the strong relationship between a country's GDP per capita and gross tertiary enrollments. These rise quite sharply in response to quite or relatively small increases in GDP per capita. And this reflects rising household incomes, the growth of middle classes, and alongside that, aspirant parents wanting more for their children. British Council researchers also identified a relationship, not a causal one, but a correlation between student mobility increases in certain countries and trade flows. So our relationship with Canada, Japan, China, South Korea, and India all see a positive correlation between student enrollments, international student enrollments, and trade. Now, so what this reflects is rising demand in countries of high population growth and youth bulges, but countries with low supply of higher education, at the same time as you have declining populations, aging populations in countries where historically you have a traditional strong higher education system and currently low supply, low demand. And this was exacerbated with the financial crash of 2008. So that dramatically affected universities. If you look at the US, public investment in higher education had been reduced by 25%. Came the crash of 2008, and the federal government relaunched Edu USA in 2010 with a budget of $635 million to try and revitalize the sector. So whilst the US remains the largest provider of education to international students in terms of the income of individual institutions, much more diversified. In the UK, by contrast, the financial crisis hit, and in 2009, the government announced cuts to the higher education sector, influenced by Osborne's efforts to reduce the country's $178 million budget deficit. So there was no relief, and in the UK, there was a disproportionate reliance, I think, on international fees. So it's against that kind of backdrop that we can look at the teaching and learning side of international higher education. The three countries that have dominated supply have been the USA, UK, and Australia, in that order. But competition is increasing. So increasingly European universities are teaching in English. There are more candidates around. So if you look at the mobility, 1% growth in the number of international students coming to the UK, which might sound okay. This is our analysis of HESA figures. But if you look at other countries and where growth is happening, you see 11% growth to Canada, 10% to the USA, 9.5% to Japan, 9% to Australia, 7% to Germany. So it's the opportunity costs of what we're doing in the UK. Now, in 2012, British Council published a report called The Shape of Things to Come, looking at student mobility trends in higher education. And in that document, we argued that public policy had a negligible effect on student decision-making choices. Boy, were we wrong. Because what happened after that in the UK was a change in public policy, the impact of our visa regime and the getting rid of the post-study visa, and that's what we see. A growth in international student mobility to other markets and a decline in our own. And that 1% in the UK is very much being made up by students from China. So what used to be a real benefit in many classes, which was the international diversity that you had in a class, in a program, was being eroded as 70% of them came from one country, as is sometimes the case. And what we have seen is a 50% drop in students from India, where we had a traditional strong relationship, a positive correlation with trade and so on, at the same time as the US saw a 25% increase of Indian students and at an estimated £4.4 billion contribution to their economy. So we were very wrong in our analysis that policy around education didn't have an impact. Now, turning to international trends around transnational education, a lot of universities have put effort and hope in transnational education, and that's sensible given that international mobility trends are getting more complex in any case. So not only is there more competition for internationally mobile students from other English-speaking countries, but there is increasing provision in countries like China, wanting to do it for themselves, and in regional hubs. So we have the growth of transnational education hubs in the ASEAN region, particularly driven by Malaysia, in the Middle East, for example, in Qatar and UEA. And what we're seeing is a shift from the first phase of globalization, if you like, where that was about connecting markets to distant markets with natural resources and cheap labor, to a greater emphasis on regional integration. If you look at this slide, this represents growth in regional traffic, air traffic. And what it demonstrates is that air traffic within regions will very soon outpace growth in long-haul air traffic. And the picture is also less Western-centric. And higher education flows, mobility flows, will mirror that. If you just, and we've got very limited data on this, but this is drawn from UNESCO data, and if you just look at their patchy data, not too bad for the ASEAN region, you'll see that the mobility of students mirrors mobility within the ASEAN region. And what this is suggesting is that international student mobility is increasingly regional. So Latin American students are going to North America if they're going to be internationally mobile, or within Latin America. In Asia, they are going to China increasingly, to Australia, of course. African students are going to India, or increasingly Mauritius, which is setting itself up as a regional higher education or TNE hub. And it does beg the question for us, what are we doing turning our back on our region? If the trend is towards regionalization of higher education, and Europe is our region where we already have strong, deep-rooted ties in research and student mobility, are we shooting ourselves in the foot? And I think this really has to be an argument that we make in the context of discussions on Brexit and higher education, which indeed I did this morning at the Select Committee of the House of Commons on that topic. So if we look at what's happening in transnational education, we can see this regional, intra-regional mobility, and it is appealing to students because you're getting your higher education at lower cost. So there's a direct benefit for the student, economic benefit. But students also look for two other things. They look for academic benefits and cultural benefits. And that's where TNE comes into its own. So universities that have got an international reputation and a TNE presence are very attractive to students because at a lower economic cost, they can get an education at a prestigious institution. And that's what they are doing. Transnational education, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, can take three forms. It can be flying faculty, either into partnership programs between, say, a UK university and a national university. It can be branch campuses, it can be licensing agreements, can be distance education, or the delivery of MOOCs and other forms of digitally delivered education. And students are very often choosing TNE over national state education. And the reasons they give are the cultural factors. So academic, economic, and culturally, they find being challenged, working with a diverse group of students. Often the courses are connected through internships and in other ways to global employers. Learning to work in intercultural contexts, all of these things matter. And when you have a domestic public higher education system that favours rote learning, old-fashioned ways of delivery, doesn't foster curiosity-driven conversations and critical thinking, they will vote with their feet and come to T&E. So all of those are very good for those of us who are involved in T&E, who want to be part of these new markets and want to be part of both the economic benefits but also the intellectual exchange. And I think if you look at the growth of T&E since its inception, what you had at the beginning was very much a model that was based on capacity building and bridging the gaps between provision in a country and the excellence of a T&E provider coming in, through to looking at joint working, qualifications, recognition, quality assurance, building the reputation, resilience and recognition of a degree. So that was the second phase. And a third phase that we are increasingly seeing now is host governments saying, whoa, all very well, very happy to have you, but on our terms. And so what you're seeing is a change or growth in regulatory frameworks for transnational education, in which they're saying, we want research-based partnerships. We want research-led universities. We want to grow our national economies at the same time. We want partnership, not eclipsing. And research that we did at the British Council on the impact of T&E on host governments very much showed this. What they resent deeply is when an international university comes in, poaches their best staff, poaches their best students, delivers something and flies out. Much preferred are those universities that build long-term relationships and are part of developing a higher education system. So, having said all that, what can we say about international trends in higher education on the teaching and learning side? I've already said that in terms of research, the assessment, the analysis is that it's quite positive at best and at worst benign, with a couple of caveats. I can't say the same for teaching and learning and knowledge dissemination. The critique is much more virulent. And here we have the argument being made that the teaching and learning side of higher education has been commoditized and commercialized, that internationalization of higher education has added to that and turned higher education into a business, into an export, subject to all the commercial pressures of the international marketplace, elevated education as a private good over its public good rationale, ignoring its social engagement and service to the community. And given the potency of this critique, which peppers the pages of international higher education journals, I think it's worth just revisiting some of the private and public good. Sorry, that one's a bit out of sync. Some of the public and private good arguments around higher education. So if you look at the UK, going back to the post-war era, where you had political stability, a good economic dividend, economic growth, and a strong social contract, public good elements of higher education saw their heyday. And you're probably seeing that replicated in some of the emerging markets now, where there's an investment in higher education for the national good. But even then, the notion of higher education as a public good was contested, and individualized notions of career advancement, educational attainment, social mobility, and the idea of education as a private investment delivering personal rather than public benefit was prevalent. And we also know that in times of economic stress, that private good element of higher education gains ascendancy over the public good elements. In the UK, it was the Deering report in the 1990s that really emphasized the notion of students as student customers, arguing that they should seek, as investors in education, value for money and a good return on their investment. And it is very much that notion that informs the policy environment today, I think, in the UK, but certainly the notion of international higher education, where students are not only able to vote with their feet, but be globally mobile when they do so. So, in that context, let's look at some of the national policies and the impacts on student choices. And here, I think there's two things to look at. One is the Teaching Excellence Framework, which is very much reinforcing students as customers, and some of the responses to that. So I've talked about the impact of our visa regime on students, and I think Brexit and some of the statements, such as that of Amber Rudd, have reinforced student choices. But I think what we can say, in spite of all of these things, is that most people would argue that there is a public and a private good element in higher education. In international education, we're recognizing very much students as customers. It is the dominant view here. What I want to turn to now is what impact that has on the third element of higher education, so knowledge production, dissemination, and then accessible application. And this is where, while we recognize the realities of having to fund education in different ways and not only through public funding, and that comes out very clearly in some of the debates in South Africa, which I can talk about in more detail if you would like in question time. We're facing also rebellions from two quarters. And I just want to turn now to look at the rebellions, both of which I think focus on this third element, which is the social engagement, civic engagement of universities. And in relation to the Teaching Excellence Framework and the focus on students as customers, I don't know if you saw recently in the article in the Telegraph, which is reporting on the House of Lords amendments and debates around the higher education bill going through at the moment. But in relation to that, a statement by Baroness Wolfe, professor at King's College London, who talks about snowflake students. So the debate is that students are being pandered to, that they can't take robust critique, they can't engage in with ideas that are not their own, the idea of the echo chamber. And I'll just quote from her. She says, "Universities are increasingly nervous about doing anything that will create overt dissatisfaction amongst students because they are being told that student satisfaction is key. It has had a real effect on the willingness of universities to stand up to student demands, which in the past have been removing statues, safe spaces, no platforming. And this whole movement is a direct threat to academic standards, the ability of universities to stand up for freedom of speech. Now, I think what's interesting about her remarks is she's not taking a sort of trade unionist position defending academic rights to protect themselves against student demands. That's not her position. Her position is that by protecting students from the robustness of debate and critique, we are giving up the public good elements that a university provides. Her objections, too, have coincided with the rise of the no platform movement sweeping across campuses, including calls for the likes of Germaine Greer to be banned from speaking due to her offensive views. And that's the rebellion from the academics saying, you know, we are here because we believe in the three elements and we believe in the public and the private goods elements of higher education. And we're worried that the commoditization, the student customer preferences are eroding that space for public debate. And then you look at the student rebellions, and in this country what we've seen is very much student rebellion influenced by international trends. And here I'm referring to the demand by students at Oriel College to remove the statue of Cecil Rhodes from its building on Oxford High Street. This was provoked by the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, which began in South Africa and which at my old university, University of Cape Town, they succeeded in having the statue of Cecil Rhodes removed. The students at Oxford weren't successful, and the rebuttal, again from academics, has been interesting. So Peter Scott at the Institute of Education has said about this, if we're going to begin to cull not very nice people, there will be a lot of empty statue plinths, a lot of returned or spurned bequests. To assert the supremacy of 21st century sensibilities of a nervous, politically correct West may not be the best starting place for exploring difference and otherness, and campaigning to remove Rhodes' statue is the easy option. He's been dead for more than 100 years. His world is never coming back. Campaigning to abolish fees or set fair access targets with teeth is today's heavy lifting. And it's that that has actually informed what's going on in South Africa with the Fees Must Fall campaign, which started as a campaign against government when they wanted to put up fees. Government acceded and fees did not go up. The campaign then moved and became directed at university councils, and the claim then was free education for all. And what you had then were students pitted against universities that were not getting sufficient funding from government, a government that could not really do a lot more in a no-growth economy, in a context where where fees in the end were not necessarily the main issue. Most poor students got and get access to funding. But those demands fall into a national context which is informed by a history of racism, of white privilege, of universities such as the one that I taught at, which worked really, really hard to become more inclusive and open, and where indeed the student body is overwhelmingly black now, but we're getting that transition in the university staff, in the ethos and the ethics of the university has been much more difficult. And part of the problem has been the problem, and I would hope ultimately the opportunity, has been the holding on to liberal values on the part of the universities. And that's played itself out in the battle between vice-chancellors, the administration of the universities, and the university councils, who have held on to the protected space for freedom of speech and freedom of engagement. And that is happening at a time where there's a faction of the student movement, indeed not the poorest, perhaps some would argue not necessarily even students, but a faction that is pushing for what is being called a fallist agenda. So it's not just fees must fall, but a decolonization of the curriculum, which I would argue is overdue in many respects, but has gone probably way too far. But also the fall of universities. So at the extreme, you've got people in the student movement saying, South Africa has had an unfinished revolution, and the place to start the finishing of that revolution is the universities. So I'm just going to share with you the perspective of a political science professor from University of Witwatersrand, who's recently been on a fellowship at Oxford, and who talked about the student leader at that university, a young man called Dlamini, a young man who is at best described as a fantasist, who admires Hitler and who has said so vocally, who was disciplined and brought to a hearing, and the university, through its liberal commitments, said if he's an elected member of the SRC, irrespective of his views, he stands. Those are the kinds of complexities. So there are no platform stand that academics are fighting against here, universities are fighting against there, but with very different kinds of arguments and very different kinds of consequences. Those are the kinds of consequences that we have seen on South African campuses, where universities have been compelled to fight back at the burning down of buildings and very militaristic responses on the part of a small minority of students. So as an optimist and as a liberal, I hope very much that the universities in South Africa will continue to keep open those spaces, to keep open the public good elements of higher education, because young Dlamini is looking very much, and his ilk are looking to close it down. And the saddest part for me is that the growth of a student movement, including many young women who have been emergent leaders, are being shouted out and locked out of engagement. So I suppose to conclude, when we look at the internationalization of higher education, we need to look beyond the great research production that and the global public goods that those address. We need to look beyond the market in international students. We need to look at how, in this international world where characterized by post-truth, by shutting down of debate, by maybe a young Dlamini isn't the only fantasist in power at the moment, where we can keep that liberal public good element of universities open, and that can be part of what we export around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Plenty to provoke us with there. I have a list of things I'd like to ask you, but I'm going to be very restrained and ask whether anyone else wishes to start the discussion. Good. That means I can. Some of the things you said were uplifting and some were quite depressing, to be honest. One point I picked out was where you said you thought that within the UK, the notion of higher education as a public good had its heyday.
It had its heyday in the post-war dispensation. We've got to fight harder to protect it now.
One could argue perhaps that it had its heyday then, in your terms, because it was an elitist activity. Surely the challenge now is to, it's a horrible word, but massify higher education while maintaining that public good principle.
I think that's a very fair point, yeah. So widening access and increasing participation is part of the public good, yeah.
I was interested by your connection between the public good and the safe spaces notion, and I think that must be absolutely right. I wonder whether you would agree that the fundamental purpose of a university is to promote intellectual discomfort.
I think so. I think the biggest danger that I see at the moment is students, and not just students, all of us in our echo chambers, on our Twitter feeds, in our social media, only listening to people who have the same ideas as us and agree with us. And I think that is coming into the classroom. So it's not, I wouldn't agree with the Telegraph that it's just snowflake students. It is the echo chamber. And universities have a really important role to break down those echo chamber silos and get people talking to each other and disagreeing.
I guess the challenge in a sense is to get people to the point where they have the confidence to engage in uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
That seems to be the challenge.
Yeah.
Do you think this is a total failure on the part of the universities, really, to express what we do and why it's so important? So I've always thought of the university as a cultural treasure house, and passing on those treasures to the next generation. You know, it comes in many forms. And if the next generation has to pay for that, it seems wrong that our generation should be charging them for it. I think it's a community activity, and everybody should be involved in sharing that. But I don't think we express that, if that's what you think as well. I don't think we express that sufficiently to counteract the sort of market forces which the sort of neoliberal economic thinking is imposing upon us. We need a sharper voice, we need a stronger set of views to fight back and make people realise what important points we have.
Yeah.
Do you think are we to blame for not expressing this?
I think the fault lines fall in different areas and different directions. So I think when there's a fault line between the academic voice, which is the voice both in South Africa and here, that is most loudly arguing for the public good elements and for the discomfort and the debate. When there's a fault line between that and university administrations, that's a problem. When there's a fault line between universities and national public policy, that's a problem. But those you can address. Where it's much more difficult is when that fault line is at an international level, because where do you address it? And I don't know the answer to that.
Question in front of you first.
Ara Zaman from the London School of Business and Management. I just wanted to pick up, I mean, the Prime Minister's speech, Brexit speech last week did mention, passing, but I think significant, mention of the Commonwealth in the speech. And I think clearly, you, in your earlier part of the presentation, when you talked about internationalization, if one thinks about good business management language, if you think about strategy, structure, and process, maybe a strategy, structure, and process approach to internationalization may be to look at the Commonwealth rather than the world. And actually, there was some very important research done by the Secretariat just a few months ago showing that whether you're a higher education institution or whether you build widgets, it's 19% less in cost to do business with any other Commonwealth country, though if you bring in together those elements. So my question really is, should we not really harness the thinking much more cogently and urgently around leveraging our Commonwealth potential here? There are challenges clearly around mobility of students, but actually, as we've been hearing in some of the other sessions here, open educational resources and all sorts of other innovations in the education space open up increasing opportunities with the Commonwealth, also anchored on two other very quick things, which are very significant. A youth demographic across the Commonwealth, which is striking. 80% under the age of 25 in many Commonwealth countries, together with the second, third generation diaspora, including here at Queen Mary, which is very different to what it was even 5 or 10 years ago. So, if you bring these things together, I think there's a significant Commonwealth opportunity, which perhaps wasn't being acknowledged sufficiently in your remarks. Your response, I'd be interested. Thank you.
you want me to? Yep. So I would absolutely agree with you about the youth demographic, the huge opportunities that Commonwealth countries present us, and our research on the relationship between long-term relationships and engagement in the UK with other countries and trade would reinforce your point. I would also agree that Commonwealth countries felt slightly aggrieved when we turned our back on them in favour of Europe. However, I think where I don't completely agree is that I think if the pendulum swings back to the Commonwealth as the solution to Brexit, that we would be in trouble. I think it's an as well as an and, not an or. And I do think we can't just replace the EU with the Commonwealth.
It takes a brave public person to state publicly that university may not be for everybody, and that maybe some people are going who shouldn't. And Wolf has had that courage. I think she's mainly talking about this country. What are your views on that?
So talking personally, not necessarily with the British Council hat on, I think it's a shame that we, both here and in South Africa actually, didn't persist with technical and vocational education with the same unhelpful results. By creating that two-tier system, it's much harder then to rebuild the value and the recognition and reputation of professional and technical education. It's absolutely the case that not everyone's for university. The industrial strategy, I think what we have to watch there, that it doesn't swing so far towards a skills agenda as, for example, the higher education or tertiary education policy in Australia has, that you lose that value, that public good value especially, of higher education institutions and universities. So there's room for both, and both are important.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that talk. I'm Kay Hack from the Higher Education Academy, and I would really like just to, I suppose, reinforce the point that you were making at the early part of your presentation, talking about many of the countries that you listed there that were growing their number of students, China, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia particularly. All of those countries are investing heavily in developing their own academic staff. They're adopting the professional standards framework. They're investing in training of their staff, and so they are very, very keen to up their game, to keep their own students, to train them at home. And okay, they may be open to collaborative partners, but they're not going to be open to us taking this colonial approach. And I think we really need to think hard about how we're developing those relationships.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Hi there, I'm Philippa Hale. I'm from ABE Education and Henley Business School as well. I've got a question. If the first iteration is individual, the second institutional, the third national, and the fourth is students who are now masters of their own global futures, what's the fifth?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I know what I'd like to see the fifth being is that those students, that international research, teaching and learning community, being a community of practice that embraces all three functions or elements of higher education and embraces the public and private good. I'm not sure, I don't think we're there yet. We're a long way off, but that would be my preferred fifth stage.
And the second question. You noted that part of the competition that's coming for this country from Europe is related to the fact that some countries and some universities in Europe are teaching in English. If you were to show us a graph, verbally as it were, not based on countries but on language, would you say that education, higher education is becoming more and more an English thing?
Yes, very much so. It's the language of global business, and that's what people want to know how to speak. And British Council, it's not in my area, but another part of it teaches English as a foreign language, and in local countries. And our competition has extended way beyond competition from the States, where it mainly came from, to companies like English First, which is a Scandinavian country, teaching English, taking up the Indonesian market. So it's not just the English-speaking countries that are teaching English.
Well, everyone thinks they have a final question. Let me ask one final one, if I may, Joe. And I think I'm going to challenge something which I thought you said earlier on, talking about transnational education, that you saw that as purely dominated by the private good. And I wanted to suggest that at least needn't necessarily be the case. I'm thinking about the sort of programs we have in China, where what is so, I think, rewarding for us as an institution is the fact that those graduates are actually global citizens, that they have clearly benefited from the best of the Chinese higher education system, but also the best of the UK. And that seems to me profoundly in the public good.
Yeah, I would agree. So I think a lot of the early motivation was very much through an economic lens. I think the insistence on a partnership approach on the one hand, and what students want and need. So they don't only want a job at the end of it. They want the academic inputs from the partner universities and the cultural, and all of that is very much a public good. So that would be the kind of platform on which you might very well build your fifth age.
Good. Well, if there are no immediate questions, I suggest that we adjourn to the Octagon for a drinks reception, when I'm sure Joe would be happy to engage in further conversation. But we've had a very stimulating lecture, very stimulating discussion. Let's all thank Joe very much.
Thank you.